I actually have many strange theories about this album. Let's go through these, shall we? This album's like a precursor to the digital avatar era, and let me explain. The pop star and media slash celebrity as predecessor to an internet digital avatar representation. This can be via the forum context for JPEG thumbnail or within the glossy social media filter. The pop star album is an ultimate "this is me" snapshot expression, both in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, if Taylor Swift or Beyonce or Miley Cyrus or Adele, whomever you want to name. The projection, the conjuring of an image of what everyone wants to be, desires to be. Self-actualization being more real as a perception from someone else, that being more real than one's own perception of oneself. One as a conglomerate of what other people think of them, of what other people's perception of them is, as a greater self, as a more realized self than the self which exists for just the self. And in a sense, why wouldn't it? Isn't that's what's remembered and not that's ultimately what exists for posterity. That's more real than what one imagines oneself to be ultimately. But if what one imagines oneself to be can be so beautifully and effectively constructed within this, either in this pop album format or within the context of an internet profile, well, that's real if unreal, isn't it? Is it not? What does that have to do with this particular album? Can't that be said of any other pop album from the 1970s, 80s, 60s, whatever? Well, here's the thing, it's how Eno presents himself here as a desirable personality to be or to want to be with on this release. He presents himself how he wants to be perceived within the context of that phenomenally musically entertaining yet quite visually sometimes jarring glam rock insecurity explosion. Here Come the Warm Jets wasn't enough. He had to really amp up this projection of a particular personality on the sophomore album, Taking Tiger Mountain by a Strategy. There might be some sort of disconnect or confusion here. What exactly is desirable about the personality that Eno is projecting on Taking Tiger Mountain exactly? Well, it's more that's not necessarily clear. It's given that it's Eno, it's a given that this is kind of abstract, really. Eno wants to be perceived as the quirkiest and most eccentric, bizarre British man alive. He perceives himself as this brilliant, eccentric David Hume or Percy Shelley type, I think, at least at this time. Something akin to this, I imagine. And he wants the rest of the world to acknowledge this as well, and it to be in some respects, the meaning and the cause of his remembrance. Doesn't every human being want to be remembered? And in the 21st century, as much as albums exist by artists attempting to explore and express how profoundly brilliant and soulful a thinker they are, or how much fun and extravagant their materialist lifestyle is, there are artists who attempt to project that they're quirky and inane and strange. Many 21st century artists try to do this. You're a Sufjan Stevens, you're a Grimes, even a Flying Lotus to some extent, and many, I'm quirky sort of indie pop artists, that they all attempt to project some sort of, whether they're inspired or not by Taking Tiger Mountain or Brian Eno, some probably are, they're trying to project this sort of, this vision that they're this eccentric genius, and it's downstream of something like Taking Tiger Mountain, I feel. That kind of personality / pathos. From David Byrne to Ariel Pink or Perfume Genius. And yet also, it is ahead of its time musically, artistically. It is purely... it is a precursor sonically to the creative... at least the creative techniques, the mentality with which digital recordings were approached. The studio as an instrument or a prototype for computer software. Music and tracks / recordings are treated as one would in a digital context, allowing for an unintuitive creativity for a 1970s music recording. The tracks are... It's not an album where the band kind of jammed together and then they recorded the results. It's you know, Eno has a drummer do this, a bass guitarist do that, his guitarist do this, and then he'll dance in front of them. All these strange things will come together in order to, and then they're spliced together in unusual ways in the recording process in order to create this abstract collage of music recordings which become a track, not something that is a, you know, it's like when the Beatles had a completely different approach to songwriting in the Revolver to Abbey Road, or at least White Album era, because they were writing music with the studio in mind and George Martin in mind, not considering that they would or wouldn't be able to play the music live. They were just experimenting with unusual tracks which weren't necessarily they weren't necessarily to perform these tunes live. And this is definitely what's going on, I feel. The tracks can be performed live, and some with great difficulty and virtuosic prowess, such as the infamous Third Uncle performed live on 801 Live, one of the great live albums, rock releases of all time, actually. Nevertheless, I digress slightly. What Taking Tiger Mountain is it's the philosophy of music recordings as instruments or tools with which to create a wider composition in and of themselves, rather than the composition being formed from the live playing of certain instruments. You can isolate the instruments and perform them in ways that are totally unintuitive or impossible live. This album is so art rock to the point that it sounds like a 1990s or 21st century art pop or neo-psychedelia. And you know, it's amazing, the British post-war, post-empire malaise manifesting in glam rock indulgence. This theorem becomes quite illustrated on Taking Tiger Mountain. Extensive references to the Opium Wars and and Chinese uprisings, drawing a beeline between children's nursery rhymes and naval jigs. This Taking Tiger Mountain presents a Britain which cannot escape its empire identity, even suspects that it cannot escape the British identity is infused with the notion of being this global empire. It's quite frightening, and yet, you know, finds some bleak humor in it. Or at least there is something bleakly amusing comic about listening to the album, I feel. Taking Tiger Mountain also represents the desire of, in the 21st century, absolutely, the desire of appreciating art, being a lucid and enlightened, euphoric and sublime curator of art. Taking Tiger Mountain today is an object of desire in and of itself for one's personality or the perception of one's personality. Appreciating Taking Tiger Mountain, it's perceived as this trippy, brilliant, always interesting world, or so it seems. That place where, that mental space wherein one values Taking Tiger Mountain, from someone at a distance, it can seem like they're in this awesome animated world where everything makes sense and they can see around corners and read between the lines. You know, it seems to imply or project this euphoria and certainty, a confidence and bliss at a distance, because to occupy a pathos is never a dream, only polished, dressed up, made up, glammed up, woken up, reality. Eno organically evolved from glam rock into art rock, into electronic musician, into digital icon, into futurist prophet. This was very natural. No album from the 20th century, pre-1990s anyway, is as 21st as Eno's Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy from 1974. Unusual. Except for maybe a couple of other Eno studio releases, that is, at least. This album makes me think of what it might be like to view oneself at a distance, in the third person, free of the internal malaises and annoyances of a pathos, of the, primal human primate pathos, and experiencing oneself as they might. They're observing their life as a tranquil, ideal, animated, projected existence. Okay, so all of this preamble, we've established really nothing about Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy by Brian Eno, other than it makes me rather insane. And so let's listen to the track list instead and see if there's any merit to what I had to say about this album. Well, probably not whatsoever, but let's find the creative genius within this piece, which I've been so enraptured with, and try and articulate it in more more grounded and sane. If for no other reason than to prove some of that horrible, horrible diatribe wrong. No, seriously, this is a wonderful album. And let's explore why that is. Let's examine this track list. Possibly the most evocative and interesting track list of all time, this is. Burning Airlines Give You So Much More, Back in Judy's Jungle, The Fat Lady of Limbourg, Mother Whale Eyeless, The Great Pretender, Third Uncle, Put a Straw Under Baby, The True Wheel, China My China, Taking Tiger Mountain. It sends you through such a strange journey. You all these odd ups and downs. This is peak sequencing in an album as far as I am concerned anyway. I cannot think of another album from the pre-1990s or during the 1970s, certainly, except for I guess a couple of other Brian Eno LPs, which sounds like it could have been composed, recorded and released in the 21st century. So much of indie pop and contemporary neo-psychedelia seems so naturally downstream of this, and like I said, Eno's operating with his instruments in his tracks, not in a live sort of sense, recording recording jam sessions. He's putting them together in this strange collage, which is much more intuitive to digital recording than it would have been to analog recording. It's absolutely, absolutely genius. Or at least phenomenally, ridiculously, absurdly ahead of its time. I mean, given that this is Brian Eno, the futurist premier of the world today, and who has been for the last 30-odd years, I mean, this should be no surprise to anyone. Albums like this are how he got this reputation, more or less. I'm going to play a game now. I'm going to look at the top 40 best-rated albums of the 1970s on Rate Your Music and compare Taking Tiger Mountain with that album and see which one seems like a more ahead-of-its-time album. Wish You Were Here. That's fairly close, to be fair. Dark Side of the Moon. Well, yeah, Pink Floyd is going to be fairly close. David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. Thoroughly a product of the 70s, brilliant as that album is. Paranoid Black Sabbath, same. Red King Crimson, yeah, it's definitely a 20th century album, as much as it influenced progressive metal of the 90s and 2000s. Pink Moon, Nick Drake. Very influential on minimal indie rock today and indie folk, although not sonically ahead of its time. I mean, in terms of technology or applications of technology. I mean, yes, no and yes, actually. Animals, Pink Floyd, ahead of its time. Unknown Pleasures, ahead of its time. Songs in the Key of Life, it seems a bit dated now, the Sonics. Low by David Bowie is lovely, but obviously there are some brilliant electronic albums from the 70s and 80s, but they're necessarily going to sound a little bit dated compared to the Sonics of the 21st century, the digital era. Led Zeppelin 4, thoroughly a 70s album. Bitches Brew, thoroughly of the psychedelic era. Close to the Edge, thoroughly prog. Marquee Moon, thoroughly New York 1970s. Blood on the Tracks, thoroughly 70s folk. Black Sabbath, Master of Reality, thoroughly 70s Sabbath. What's Going On, Marvin Gaye, thoroughly 70s soul. Station to Station by Bowie is fairly ahead of its time. We will say that. Can by Can's Future Days. Ahead of its time compositionally, although the production is very much of its time. It's slightly more lo-fi compared to the other Can albums. The one afterward, Soon Over Babylon, is a bit like Can's Tales from Topographic Oceans. Black Sabbath is very 1970 on the dot. Targo Margo by Can was certainly ahead of its time. There are some albums here that are ahead of their time, but I don't think quite as much as Taking Tiger Mountain, though. Feel free to agree or disagree. Inner Visions by Stevie Wonder, so 70s. After the Gold Rush, Neil Young, it's such an early 70s folk album. Funhouse by the Stooges, very lo-fi, garagey, influential very much in the short term, and excuse me, definitely on the kind of garage rock revival acts of the 2000s, but not as forward-thinking or as long-term influential as TTM. London Calling by The Clash, you could almost say the same thing. Hunky Dory by Bowie's brilliant, and definitely, this is definitely the groundwork for Taking Tiger Mountain, for whatever that's worth. On the Beach, Neil Young, you could say the same thing about After the Gold Rush here, though this is a really good album. Oh, here's that, Club da Esquina, Milton Nascimento, and Borges, it's the Brazilian album. That's a very good album. Kind of a traditional album in its own context. Steve Reich, Music for 18 Musicians, in its own context. George Harrison, All Things Must Pass. I'm actually not a fan of this album. There's some goofy stuff on here. Apple Scruffs. I don't like that full spectre wall of sound on here. What is Life? Ugh, yuck. Rumours by Fleetwood Mac is brilliant. Very hi-fi of its era. I mean, it's proven to be timeless, but I don't know if it's proven to be ahead of its time as such. In terms of it being continually relevant to young people, maybe. Blue by Joni Mitchell is what it is, not necessarily ahead of its time. Okay, the most ahead of its time album, along with TTM here, is of course Eno's follow-up, Another Green World. Joni and Satchidananda, Alice Coltrane featuring Pharoah Sanders. Okay, if there's any album that's as good or better than Taking Tiger Mountain, it's this one. I don't know, to say a jazz release would be ahead of its time, or prophesizing the 21st century is a bit unusual. I mean, it's a different era, I might say. Songs of Love and Hate, Leonard Cohen, singer-songwriter stuff. I mean, that's the peak singer-songwriter, don't get me wrong. Age Bamyasi by Can, well, that was ahead of its time, to be sure. Can is certainly comparable to Eno in this respect. Like Songs in Our Speak, ridiculous. Peak King Crimson, and as ahead of its time as King Crimson is, which is to some extent. Metal by Pink Floyd, solid Pink Floyd, I don't know how it's the most advanced of Pink Floyd's, or prophetic of its releases, of their releases. Fear of Music by Talking Heads. Well, Talking Heads are fairly ahead of their time in their context. Raw Power by the Stooges, prophesizing the punk movement of the next few years in the States and the UK, and Australia. We had a few groups, Saints. Oh, sorry for that boring meandering, but my point is, Take Tiger Mountain is leagues ahead of most of these albums. I mean, I truly think that, with the exception of some of the Pink Floyd, Can, and other Eno, none of the albums ever really came that close. And it's like King Crimson somewhat to Eno in terms of being a prophet of the 21st century as we know it now. And in the 21st century, in the social media epoch, what could be more useful than an album that screams, just yells at the top of its lungs, "How weird and strange and quirky am I, my friends?" Glam rock was a manifestation of that post-British Empire malaise, and in this era of great uncertainty, all we can do is trying to draw attention to ourselves. Brian Eno realised this in 1974, and everyone attempting to listen to this album and blast it, perhaps myself included, in order to, make something of their lives, make their lives seem as interesting as their brain, as creative and interesting as Eno's was when apparently, composing and recording this album. And, well, given the actual results of this album, listening to it, you do want to be where Eno was when he was creating this album. It seems like the most desirable place of all time, not because of how he projects himself, but because of the results. Oh my goodness. This is a level of, if Eno's freedom and creativity in pure, unadulterated, shameless rapping led to this, his stream of consciousness, his confidence and trust in his self led to Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. I mean, then this is possibly one of the most empowering works of art, artifacts, documents of all time. That's just, it bowls me over. One of the most impressive and re-listenable works of 20th century recorded music for my ears.